Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Zoominar producer, and I want to thank you for joining us for today's important conversation, The Rise of Anti-Semitism Since October 7th, with Ira Forman and Sarah Breger. This program, which is part of a Moment series on anti-Semitism, supported by the Joyce and Irving Goldman Family Foundation, can be found on our website at momentmag.com. We will continue hosting conversations in the coming days and weeks, and Moment's editorial team is always updating our website with new articles. Again, you can find all of this at momentmag.com. Now for today's program. Ira N. Forman is a senior fellow at the Moment Institute, where he curates Moment's anti-Semitism monitor. He is also a visiting professor and senior fellow at Georgetown University Center for Jewish Civilization and serves as senior advisor on anti-Semitism at Human Rights First. Ira is the former U.S. State Department Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Antisemitism. Sarah Breger is the director of Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Sarah has won numerous awards, including first place for Religion Reporting of the Year from the Religion News Association and first place for Best In-Depth News Writing on Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Please welcome Ira Forman and Sarah Breger.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thanks for organizing this. And thank you, Ira, for taking the time.
My pleasure.
Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that it feels particularly apt to be having this conversation on the 85th anniversary of Kristallnacht. And there's a lot to get to because a lot has happened since October 7th. But I wanted to start with a question about numbers and percentages. A few days ago, Jonathan Greenblatt said that there has been a 388% increase of anti-Semitism in America. And then when I opened my JTA headlines this morning, two caught my eye. Anti-Semitic incidents up 800% in the Netherlands since October 7th, and London sees anti-Semitic hate crimes jump 1,350% since start of Israel-Hamas war. Could you unpack a little bit what these numbers and percentages actually mean?
Well, Sarah, when people ask me at any point, but certainly in the last few weeks, has there been an increase in anti-Semitism? My stock answer is the Pope Catholic? Yeah, of course. It's obvious. But everybody cites either the ADL numbers in the United States, which count incidents, or the FBI numbers, which counts hate crime data. And it's a useful, quick, and dirty way to think about things, but they have flaws, and there's lots more data that, I tell my students at Georgetown, there's lots more data you have to look at if you're really going to be serious about this. So the answer, of course, is yes, but both the FBI and ADL data have problems. I mean, it's not to denigrate them. They're the best things we've got and useful. But there's other data. There's data on Jewish reactions. There's polling data on how Jews feel about this. I haven't seen anything since October 7th, but I suspect we will. There's data on attitudes about anti-Semitism in the United States. ADL puts some things out, Pew puts things out, all kinds of things. There's measures of violence because every incident, there's a big difference between someone getting killed or any assault or violence and something like graffiti on a building. So those ADL numbers, the hate crime numbers, they don't tell you that. And where it is coming from is actually really, really important. And one of the few good signs in the United States is the worst place it can come from. You can come from different parts of civil society. The worst place it can come from is from governments. And unlike the 30s or Kristallnacht, it is by and large in the West, at least, not coming from governments, and certainly not from this government, neither from Congress or the executive branch, et cetera. And why I say governments are so important, because governments have monopoly on violence in the society, at least legitimate violence. And when you get governments playing that game, we see that around the world. We see it certainly in places like Iran. We're seeing it in some places in South America. We're seeing it in other, places, and that raises the stakes a lot. The other question I think you and I spoke about a little bit is it just that there are more incidents or more hate crimes, or is it gotten worse? And as I kind of alluded on violence, the answer again is both. But I do think even more interesting is the reaction of the Jewish community. And I haven't seen data on this, but you don't have to be a genius or a rocket scientist to read any Jewish publication, but also the major newspapers like the Times and the Post, and see the reaction of the community. This is different. This is really different. The fear that is going on, I've never seen before. And I think there's some good legitimate reasons for it.
I think actually the Federation put out this morning a study. I mean, and it's just, they're polling that 70% of American Jews feel concerned about, their safety since October 7th.
Well, Sarah, you're not supposed to know that before it's a little embarrassing because you're supposed to be putting the anti-Semitism monitor together. So, but despite that, that's a good data point. Now, try to make sure we get it into anti-Semitism monitor.
But my question kind of is, should we be worried? I mean, how worried should American Jews be?
Well, that's great. That's a great question. And that's requires us to, in some ways, to peer into the future. And as one of my favorite political persons says, the pollster Mark Mellman says, and when he's always asked to predict the future, he says, for my people, meaning the Jewish people, prophecy died in about the 3rd century BCE. So it's risky to say, but I'd say something. I mean, I would have told you in the last year or two, I've been shocked at the levels of anti-Semitism, the intensity of anti-Semitism, and what we're seeing here is very concerning. Now, will it have long-term implications? I think so, but I don't know exactly what. I think we can talk a little bit about that. But there's a lot of reason to be concerned. But I mean, we can talk about, I think one of the main pieces here is anybody who's been following this issue knows that people, like every other issue in the United States, people use this as a political weapon. So people on the right say, well, this is all really, okay, there's a few Nazis out there, but it really always comes from either Muslim Americans or Muslims in general, or it comes from the political left on the campus. And on the left, we've heard a lot of, oh, come on, give me a break. Yeah, okay, there's something, maybe you get a single person once in a while saying something crazy on the left, but basically all the violence, which up to now has pretty much been true, is from the right. And the lesson here, and we'd be crazy not to follow that lesson, the lesson here is it comes from everywhere. Now, at any given time, it might come more from one place or another. But in the United States and in much of Western Europe, et cetera, it comes from multiple places. And if you're not really honest about where it's coming from, even if it's coming from your side, we're not going to deal with this issue in any serious way. And I think what we've seen, particularly since October 7th in the United States, is this really a revelation, though I think a lot of people on campuses already knew some of this was going on, of a deep infection on the left of serious anti-Semitism. And you can't just say violence is now just on the right, because it's not, and it hasn't been. And by the way, anyone on the right tries to tell you right now that, oh, proves us we're true. Well, look at folks on the extreme right, Nazis, but not just Nazis, people on nationalist right. There are people on the nationalist right, not all of them, who are on what some people call the Christian right here. Although I don't want to make it a religious issue, but the extreme right who are taking advantage of this because they too are very anti-Zionist and very anti-Israel and of course anti-Semitic. And they're using it to fan the flames. So, there are no clean hands here on either left and right. And if we're not really honest about that, we're in real trouble.
So what has the reactions to October 7th taught us about the nature of today's anti-Semitism?
I think the left, right, the amount of anti-Semitism we're seeing from the left, the amount on college campuses is really stunning. So I was at a meeting probably 3 or 4 years ago that the Conference of Presidents put on in New York. bringing folks from the organized Jewish world together to talk about anti-Semitism. There was a breakout on campus anti-Semitism, and there were some dire predictions, but I was interested at that time, and I asked the panel, there's I think something like 3,000 colleges and universities in the United States, and I asked, how many is the problem of anti-Semitism really serious on? Because I had my own preconceptions on it, and I think it was the AJC representative said about 75 or 80. Now, that's not a lot. Now, of course, they were and continue to be places like the Ivy League, elite liberal liberal institutions, small liberal arts colleges, et cetera, West Coast, East Coast, Upper and Midwest, which probably have some outside influence. I think you'd have to say today, without having looked at actual data, I'd be surprised if someone doesn't give me a number much, much bigger than that right now. It is on places, Georgetown, I always thought, teach there a bit, and I always see it as in terms of campus life, relatively conservative. There was an SPCJ, Students for Justice in Palestine, organization there, but not that active, et cetera. You didn't see much. There's a fair amount now in Georgetown we've seen in the last few weeks, and it's really frightening. So I think that's a piece of it. I think also, I've always said, and I think it's still true, that the Muslim American population is very different than other Muslim diaspora populations like in Western Europe. It's by and large, it's highly educated, it has relatively high income levels. It's very diverse, from people from Arab countries, from African American Muslims, from the Indian subcontinent. Very diverse, very different in many ways, Shiite and Sunni. And it has not been radicalized and it had not been, and I still think it is not to the same degree. But we've heard for 30 years. I remember even probably going back to AIPAC when I was there in the early 80s, people saying, well, the rise in Muslim population, particularly Arab Americans, but in more recent decades, Muslim populations in general, will lead to a lessening of Jewish influence in the United States. And we never really saw it. I think we're seeing more of it now. And you look at the crowds coming out for some of these organizations, and it's a crowd that's not just Muslim Americans. And frankly, again, we should be very careful. This is not all Muslim Americans by any stretch of the imagination, but not an insignificant portion, as well as people on the extreme left, the ideological left. I think you're definitely seeing a larger political action on it. Now, I also think we have to be clear that there is a real split between, say, some of public opinion. Look at sympathy toward Palestinians and Israelis among Democrats, and you see some little shocking numbers. And we've seen it now in the last few years. I think as the Gaza war goes on, we're probably going to see an increase in support from Palestinians already. But that has not translated in any serious way to political elites, elected officials, particularly on the national level. There's a huge divide there because on the national level, there still is a tremendous amount of very strong support for Israel in this situation.
Could you argue that's a generational divide in a way?
Yeah, I think that's a piece of it. Yeah, that is a generational divide. There's no question about it. The other thing that we're also seeing, interestingly, the American Jewish community has been very divided, as you know, on Israel over the last decade or so. And, the saying is the most controversial discussions in synagogue today, what a lot of rabbis don't want to bring up, is Israel, because it splits their congregations, et cetera, and there's no win here. That's really changed in what's happened the last month. I don't know how long it will last. There is a significant minority of people, often associated with the left, often situated in campuses, but not always, but also certainly younger people, supportive of non-Zionist or anti-Zionist organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, and they're not insignificant. But the rest of the community is much more united than I've seen in a long time. Whether that will last and how long that will last is another question.
I mean, that's
I
sort
think
of,
also, by the way, it mirrors what's happening in Israel, where there's a rally around the flag, even despite the huge opposition to the prime minister right now, which is beginning to get more prominence, but still, there's still a lot of, well, we'll deal with this when the war is over.
so you just mentioned, Jewish Voices for Peace and If Not Now. And that kind of leads to maybe, my biggest question, is what they're doing anti-Semitic, or are they just anti-Zionist? And I think that's sort of the question that's been coming up with so many of these protests. Where do you draw the line? How do you make a distinction?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Let me just, before we get to that, let me say one other thing. Most of what I've just talked about implications may not be so great for Israel. But there's something else. And I think I tend to lean on history a lot when I try to analyze what's going to happen. I don't try to be a prophet, but it's inevitable. We're trying to think about what's down the road, what's around the corner, what's over the horizon. And I like Mark Twain's, ostensibly, supposedly, Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And it's really important to find the rhymes. And one of the rhymes may be, at least someone of my age thinks about what happened in the late 60s and early 70s. There was a radicalization on the left coming out of the Vietnam War, coming out of racial injustice, coming out of violence in the streets, etc., to white racism. And there was a huge backlash, not just what we consider the George Wallace or Nixon Southern strategy backlash, a backlash which went after the more, I would say, just from my political perspective, unreasonable pieces of the left. And I think there's a possibility of seeing this. The thing that keeps coming up in my mind all the time, when I see what's going on campus, when I see what some of the rhetoric out of the left, and by the way, I'm a person of the left. I've been a Democratic operative, et cetera, and Democratic politics, and consider myself liberal, progressive, et cetera, for decades. But the words that come up for the characterization I like to use is something that supposedly Lenin said, but probably didn't, but other kind of Soviet leaders, et cetera, eventually did. And that is useful idiots. The idea that there are people who were not Bolsheviks, not communists in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, who had this view of the Soviet Union as this utopian type of society, and that overlooked or didn't want to know about all the violence and all the irrationality that was coming out of those movements. And what we have here on the left here, from my perspective at least, parts of the left, and again, this is not at all an indictment of all the left, far from it. But we're seeing this now of a Manchian worldview of black and white. You either have a black hat on or a white hat on. And what's the way you determine this? You're either a colonialist or colonialist settler in the terms of Israel, and you wear a black hat. And everybody else who opposes colonialists or settlers or anti-colonialists, they wear the white hat. So what I like to ask some of my friends and even family who are supportive of some of this stuff, I say, the first thing before I argue any issues, I say, you're allying yourself with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with Putin, with North Korea, with the Ayatollahs, with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, with the Houthis. These are the scum of the earth. All the things on the left we've always said, equality, anti-homophobic, anti-misogynist, democratic principles, anti-authoritarian, all those things are the people that you are supporting and you're allied with. Whether you say you're supporting them, you are allied with, you have the same positions, you're supporting them. All those things are those people. And try to go live in one of these societies, being a liberal or progressive, and see how long you live, let alone able to say anything or to espouse any of your views. Isn't something wrong here? And that type of backlash, people on the left, I mean, Judith Butler, who who today will say, I've gathered that some like Hamas is the problem. But in the aughts was saying, these are people, Hezbollah and Hamas are part of the left. This is craziness. And, I have this sense that there will be a backlash. And many of us who were maybe pretty radical in the late 60s and early 70s, within 10 years, we weren't anymore. So maybe that's a counterfactual that this doesn't mean that ad infinitum, all this whole generation is going to be haters of Israel. Now, we get to the key question, does anti-Zionism equal anti-Semitism? It's a great question. And I would say when I first got more involved in this whole issue, and particularly my early days as the U.S. Special Envoy on anti-Semitism, I would have kind of said, yes, it is equal. And I've changed a little bit of my mind. There was a piece in the Atlantic by Adam Swerve about this. And I had to say, I agreed with the larger premise. Anti-Semitism is not always equal to anti-Zionism or vice versa. But it often is. And so let's give you an example. If you tell me that you are anti-Zionist and you don't believe in a Jewish homeland, which is, the larger kind of macro definition of anti-Semitism, of Zionism, and not talking about any particular form or evolution of Zionism. But you also say, look, I'm an anti-nationalist everywhere. I believe nationalism in general, or in most cases, is something I would oppose. I'm not going to call you anti-Semitic. If you are religiously believe that a Jewish state should not exist until the Mashiach comes, I may think this is stupid or whatever, but I'm not going to call you an anti-Semite. So there are some instances, and we tend to, overuse the term anti-Semitism. It's a precious term. When you call someone an anti-Semite, it's serious. You've hit them in the face with a 2x4. There's not going to have much of a conversation after that. You can criticize what people say sometimes and not use anti-Semitism. Don't overuse it. But there's another piece of this. And the other piece is, on the left, you hear constantly people say, well, if you criticize Israel, you're called an anti-Semite. Well, yeah, somebody's going to call you anti-Semite. I know some people on the extreme right in Israel and here will say that. But the vast majority of us who consider ourselves Zionists wouldn't say that. We criticize Israel all the time. This is a cop-out. This is whataboutism. When you say something stupid, and then someone comes back and says, well, what about this? I get charged with this. In the classic case, it's a great piece written by a laborite, a strong socialist who was a big opponent of Corbyn's anti-Semitism. He described a labor activist in the last few years who was kicked out of the Labor Party for anti-Semitic statements. She was brought back in, and then she made a series of statements not about Israel, had nothing to do with it, about Jews controlling the media, etc. Made 4 or 5 of these statements publicly and was kicked out again. And as soon as she was kicked out, she screamed, oh, look, you can't criticize Israel, you get called an anti-Semite. She didn't talk about Israel. This is something that has become a meme, to the left. Oh, you can't criticize Israel. Of course you can criticize Israel. Do you want to demonize Israel? Do you want to say Israel is worse than China and Iran and North Korea and say that it's committing genocide? Or as the Barnard chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace late last year in 2022 said, oh, not only is Israel a genocidal colonial settler state, but it's killed millions of Palestinians. In what universe has Israel called millions of Palestinians? That's blood libel. These are supposed to be smart young women at Barnard who are whether do they hate Jews? You don't have to say anti-Semitic things or support something that's anti-Semitic and say in your own head, oh, I hate Jews. That's not the definition of anti-Semitism by any stretch. This is crazy stuff. So will there be a backlash? Maybe. And so the question, I've pontificated enough, but the question is, yes, sometimes anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are not the same, but often it is.
just to push a little bit, because I know in left-wing Jewish circles, there's a lot of debate or a lot of hurt that, Jews who are calling for a ceasefire, for example, are being labeled anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And, does that fall into an anti-Semitic side, or is that just
Yeah, well,
being mislabeled?
if you want the world to be really simple, you say, okay, here's the bright line, you can't step over it. And that's not how the world works. It's all about context. And look, I personally don't believe a ceasefire, as we would say at this point, is what is needed. I wouldn't call that person necessarily at all anti-Semitic. I might disagree with them. I might even say, I think this is simple-minded or naive, but that's a matter of debate. They may say the same about me, or saying that I'm, insensitive to the killing of children in Gaza. I think that's a legitimate discussion, but it's always context. This also bleeds into the question of the working definition of anti-Semitism, or the Ira definition, which I think people have criticized as being vague, etc. It says these are things that may be anti-Semitic, some things about Israel and other things may be anti-Semitic depending on context, and that criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic. That vagueness is important because you have to take the context as it comes, etc. And you have to also say, as we talked about earlier, just throwing around the term anti-Semitism is not a smart thing to do. It's not a good way to fight anti-Semitism, by the way, because if you cry wolf enough, your genuine slam dunk charges of anti-Semitism are going to be ignored. And so, yeah, I think the context is terribly important here. And the overuse of anti-Semitism is a big problem in the fight against anti-Semitism.
And then this is a question about a specific phrase that has been coming up a lot in the news, from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. That's been viewed by some people as, anti-Semitic, and some people say it's actually just, a chant of freedom. And I know, GW, there was a case where I think people were flashing that, on the buildings.
Yeah, among other things, yes.
Yeah.
Glory to our martyrs was something else they flashed on the building.
Yes, right. So where does that fall on the spectrum?
That's a great question. It's context. I think if you ask Hamas what they mean by this, it's very clear. Yeah, they mean no Israel. They mean, the ideology is essentially any Jews who are descended from people who were in Israel before 1918 or 1917, when Balfour was 1918, or maybe 1917, that's 7% of Israel. They can stay. Everybody else got to go, or everybody else got to be killed. So I think from what that has historically meant, you could also argue that no, it's not that extreme. But it certainly implies, in my mind, a one-state solution. And that gets to another question, and it also says, well, if you support a one-state solution, are you anti-Semitic? And I would say no. You might, and frankly, there are people, as we all know, on the right in Israel who do support a one-state solution. It's not the one-state solution Hamas has in mind, or even probably much parts of the Palestinian Authority. But and I've seen reasonable people, certainly well-meaning people, saying, yeah, this is a reasonable thing. Well, I go to either history and how the Middle East works. This is not an easy little neighborhood here we're living in. The Israelis are living in. Give us an example of a one-state solution. Well, the best you have in the Middle East by far is Lebanon. And frankly, Jews are not given the same respect at some level, certainly the last century or so, as Christians are. The possibility of a minority in a Palestinian so-called Israel state, possibilities of that working, you have to be pretty naive to say that there's any possibility that's a workable solution. And by the way, I think that goes to the right as well. in Israel. You can't, it's very, very difficult. So, yeah, these are all tough things. I think if someone says to me, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, I might not automatically say you are an anti-Semite. I'll say this is outrageous. This is if you want to talk about this is more than kumbaya, and this is far from kumbaya. And if you don't acknowledge that, you may say, well, I believe it's kumbaya. Okay, fine, but in its practical implications, hard to believe that it has a very dire future for the vast majority of Jews in Israel. And again, it goes back to the whole question, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. Well, if you believe Jewish nationalism is the only nationalism, and again, you can define a Zionism in a much more less aggressive way than parts of Zionism have been defined. If you believe that's, that the only nationalism that's illegitimate is Jewish nationalism in Palestine, Israel, then I have a real problem with you. I may not want to call you an anti-Semite at the given time, but I think there are some really strong anti-Semitic problems here. And really, you have to ask yourself, what kind of double standard am I having and putting on the Jewish people? And this is not to take any one of the other things I hear on the left often in recent weeks too is this is really a simple question. It goes back to the Manchian view, black and white. This is a real simple question. No, it is not a simple question. No, it is not just Israel always right and Palestinians always wrong, but it certainly isn't the other way either. It is not a simple question. If you don't understand historical context, if you don't understand what's the likelihood of a realistic solution that possibly could work, if you want to ignore all those things, it's very problematic. Whether you want to call it anti-Semitic or not, it's a hugely problematic. And if you're part of the much of the Jewish people, you're looking at history and saying this is the beginning of true genocide, not just fake genocide. This is true genocide because is the possibility of true genocide. So all these things are, again, it is crazy to say this is a simple answer on either side. It is very complex, but we have got people have got to know what truly is meant by from the river to the sea.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think actually there might be a backlash to people saying how simple it is. I know I see on, some of my more left-wing listservs, that's where the fights break out, is when people say
this is simple, yeah.
This is simple, and then people come back with that.
Yeah.
I wanted to
simple on some other planet,
right.
Not on planet Earth.
I wanted to turn to kind of away from the United States, just because it really seems outside the United States, anti-Semitism it's really paired with violence. I'm thinking about what happened in Dagestan. I'm thinking about even, windows smashed in London and all these different things. I mean, are you worried about real violence, outside of the U.S.?
Well, I'm worried in the United States more than I ever have been about real violence. I mean, we are getting more violence, and we're likely to get more. I mean, what was it? In L.A. yesterday, apparently at the Museum of Tolerance run by the Simon Wiesenthal Center, they had this private showing of this Army IDF film of the atrocities, and there was protesters and counter protesters, and there was physical violence. There was fights breaking out. So we're seeing more and more of this. So the first answer is I'm afraid in the United States. The second answer is I have always worried much more about the fate of diaspora communities outside the United States than the United States diaspora. And it's very simple. People talk about a golden age of Spain. There is a golden age of Jewry in the United States. Whether it lasts or not, I don't know. but we are a bigger percentage of the population by far than any other diaspora community. We are something like 80, high 80s, 90%. North American Jewry is of all of the entire diaspora. We are situated with high income levels, high education levels, in the last 50 years, extremely high levels of political organization, even though in the last 2 decades or so, we've been very split on what that means for Israel. And on almost every issue, the Jewish community is split. It's not like, if there is a cabal, as many of our friends on the right and left think of Jews sitting someplace deciding issues, no one's told me about it because I've not heard about it. Because
we're really bad at it.
Yeah, or we're really, really bad. And all I see is Jews fighting each other on things. Having said that, there is, and we don't run Hollywood, and we don't run the banks, and we don't run all these things. We don't run the environmental movement. We're not responsible for all immigration, et cetera. Having said that, we play a really serious role and an outside role in American politics and policy. Even if we can agree on issues, we are well situated. And you see it in the Biden administration, how Biden has dealt with this issue and has also, obviously made a lot of people on parts of the left and Democratic left unhappy about it. Mm-hmm. But we have tremendous strengths. And then other diaspora communities, as well placed as they are, et cetera, they often face much, 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 and especially in Western Europe, Muslim populations that are 10 times their size, that are whether it's France or it's Germany or it's the Low Countries, much larger Muslim minorities and Jewish minorities, much less influence, even though you find people at the top of the political structures in some of these countries that are Jewish, et cetera. I worry much more, and even in the last month, much more about diaspora communities. And we don't think about it that much in this country. We thought about it, I think, maybe a little more prior, maybe to the last 8 or 9 years. Mm-hmm. But, we've been thinking justifiably, we as a community, about how we're experiencing this and how we have to, be putting guards in front of our synagogues and upping all the physical infrastructure and making sure our Jewish schools can't have a truck bomb drive up to them, et cetera. These are things that people in Europe have been dealing with for 15 or 20 years. And we are much better situated to deal with it, fortunately or unfortunately. These other countries, there are Jewish communities that, when you have a couple thousand Jews in a place like Norway, it doesn't take much to end those communities. And that means 300 or 400 years of a community gone down the drain. And in the case of a place like Greece, where 5,000 Jews live, it's 2.5 millennium of Jewish presence is threatened here. Like many of the countries in the Middle East, which have no Jewish populations and had 2,500 years of Jewish populations. And the threats to these countries, and yeah, it depends on where they are, but I can, off the top of my head, I can name 15 or 20 countries I'm really concerned about. Not just in the last month, but I have been concerned about. And even sometimes it's not an anti-Semitic issue directly. Is banning circumcision, which often is targeted at Muslim minorities more than Jewish minorities, is that anti-Semitic? Well, I don't really think it's fair to say it in all cases at all that it is anti-Semitic, but it is a huge threat to the viability of Jewish communities in places like Norway or Netherlands, et cetera, or any place in Scandinavia. And these are small communities. They're not insignificant. They have some influence. They're involved in politics. Nothing like the United States, just nothing. And Latin America, similarly. You look what's going on in South Africa right now. South African government has just broken relations essentially with Israel, and it's saying the ruling party is saying some really, and the government, really nasty things about Israel and Hamas. Very scary there. The Argentinian community, a really large community. I haven't read so much now, but there's been some things like residential buildings with Stars of David being put on them. And you hear from Argentinian Jewish leaders, this is just the beginning. You have 3 or 4 South American leaders who are breaking relations with Israel, and in some cases really demonizing Israel in a terrible way. And again, when you have, as I go back, when you have governments who are involved in this stuff, you really should start worrying. When the state is involved, you really need to start worrying. So the answer is, yeah, it is worse. They have it worse in the UK, in France, in Germany. There's all these places people talk about, do the community survive? I think they will, at least in the short to medium run. But they are much more threatened.
Yeah. So some of what you were talking about reminded me a little bit of, what happened in 2014 after the, Gaza incursion. Is there any way to draw any lessons of what happened afterwards for us here?
I haven't thought so much about it. I mean, sometimes, as you say, it's a precursor. We had in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. 2014, before the Gaza war, which was in August and September of 2014. In the spring of 2014, there were anti-government protests against the socialist government. And one of the protests actually had participation from the far left of the socialist government, from Muslim communities, and from the far right, Le Pen's far right. And they were marching through Paris saying essentially the same thing. Jews will not, France is not yours, Jews, France is not yours. And we're all together. I mean, enemies, ideological enemies. And so 3 years later, we see it pop up in the United States. Not sure it always works that way, but yeah. I mean, I think in the security level, there's a lot to learn from Europe. And I was talking to someone about this about 3 or 4 months ago, and what they reminded me was that there isn't the violence in the United States that has been in Europe. Maybe that's changing.
Mm-hmm. I want to get to questions. I have a lot more questions, but I do want to get to other people's questions too.
Sure.
So let me go to some that some people sent in before the program. One person wants to know, how does the rise of anti-Semitism, parallel or vary from the rise in Islamophobia?
Great question. One of the things I think it's important for us, again, there's a lot of nuance here. There are lots of parallels. For example, how do you confront anti-Semitism? How do you confront Islamophobia? I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, any type of expert on Islamophobia. But I know, the one thing I know enough is that there are commonalities, but there are also differences. There's differences between racism, classical racism, and anti-Semitism. One of the differences, huge differences, Jews may be considered by Nazis and other anti-Semites in some way subhuman, but they're extremely smart and clever subhumans that manipulate lower other subhumans against the white majority, whether it's here or in Europe, etc. This is classical. When you're fighting Jews, you're kind of fighting upward. They're too clever, they're too smart. You don't find this usually in a lot of racism. One other thing that's different than many other forms of bigotry is you don't need Jews for anti-Semitism. We have anti-Semitism in many, you just look at what's going on in the internet right now in China, where I have had one of my successor in the Trump administration, who did some really nice work. One of the things we disagree with a lot is he believes the way to confront this stuff is philo-Semitism. Well, I think that's a terrible way to confront this, because in much of East Asia, including China, there has been a lot of philo-Semitism, and now suddenly, out of the blue, we have the government is allowing this on the internet, some really nasty anti-Semitism coming up. And so there's a fine line between philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism.
Yes.
And this is not a way to go about the confronting the problem. So, yeah, there are commonalities, And one of the things that I was going to say, and one of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit is what can we do about this? And one of the things that has to be doing, I can go through a whole litany, but rather on this issue, as importantly, we need allies to fight anti-Semitism. The Jewish community, either here or and in Israel, are not going to deal with anti-Semitism alone. We need allies. We need allies all through civil and government, and we've had some really good allies in government, not just in the United States, but much of Europe, not all of Europe, and that's great. But we need allies in civil society, and we need allies among minority communities, whether it's African American, Latinos, Hispanics, etc., and the LGBTQ community. And we sometimes don't have as much support as we'd like in some of these communities, but we need them. And that also means we have to fight with them on their issues, not on all their issues, but and when it comes to racism, when it comes to homophobia, when it comes to misogyny, we ought to be, we have been, but we need to be willing to stand up and be public and open about this. And one of the biggest tools I think we have is social ostracism. It's a whole other topic. When the whole doxing question comes up, et cetera, we can maybe get into that.
Yeah.
But we one of the ways you fight this stuff is on civil society level, and it can't be just Jews. We need allies, and those communities, by the way, need allies as well.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when thinking about allies, sometimes I worry that the Jewish community is often looking for perfect allies, and refusing to settle for imperfect allies in a way. We're sometimes very critical of our friends when they try to say a statement or do something. Sometimes, often we'll come back and say, no, this is not this type of statement we want. We want a different statement that says this type of thing.
Aren't we supposed to be a stiff-necked people sometimes?
Right.
Okay. I think we might agree on some of that. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, I think part of that is when part of having some sense of how democracies work. That's particularly important. That you may not get 100%, but the existential issues, you'd hope your allies are going to be there for you.
And can we talk about the doxing question that you brought up? I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about it, and I'm not sure that I'm like almost everything. I don't have all the answers. But I do believe this. Look, I think the idea of telling people where you live and something about your family should be off the charts. It's not illegal. It's not violating First Amendment, but it should be, that type of stuff where you are threatening people with violence, even implied violence or a wink and a non-violence, is totally inappropriate. However, I also believe part of free speech is, yes, we have free speech. And but free speech means that you ought to be willing to take criticism from others and take negative stuff from when you do things. So the idea that a law firm doesn't want to hire someone who thinks that Hamas is a democratic liberal ally and that Israelis are subhuman or at least genocidal colonial settlers, I have no problem with that. When I forget his name, right after the Trump election of 2016, one of the most prominent neo-Nazis, his family was in not Missoula.
Oh, Richard Spencer, maybe?
Yeah, Richard Spencer.
Missouri or not Montana.
Yeah, it's in Montana. His hometown, in that period, there was a lot of discussion. His mother said that Jewish real estate agent was trying to shut her business down.
In Whitefish, Montana.
Whitefish, exactly.
I remember the name.
Got really nasty. And when Richard Spencer started, he didn't live in Whitefish, but he came back to see his family. There were lots of stories about every time he came to Whitefish, he'd go into restaurants and people would kick him out. I gotta say, I have no problem with that. We have seen the taboos about anti-Semitism and taboos, frankly, about some issues of racism, etc., or immigration. The taboos have been broken down. Things that no one would say because it was socially unacceptable, even if you believed it. So you hid under your rocks. People have come out from under the rocks. And one of the strongest things, we have a very strong civil society. And I believe in the First Amendment. The government should not arrest you. The government should not persecute you for speech unless it's, encouraging imminent violence. But there can be other consequences for speech. Martin Luther King would say, when we break laws, I'm willing to go to jail for it. There are implications for this. Well, if you say things that are heinous, look, that's why the Klan even now has a hard time speaking up on college campuses or anyplace else, because, if they speak up, they are shut down immediately, and there are consequences to their racism. That's not to say that lots of forms of racism that are not as overt take place all the time and get away with it. But social ostracism is a powerful tool, not doxing in the sense of putting people at risk or their families at risk or anything, but saying, look, there's consequences. You may not get a job you want. You go out and commit violence, you get in a fist fight like head of the Harvard Law Review the other day with a Jewish student. They surrounded this Jewish student, including this head of the Harvard Law Review, and wouldn't let him get by. They had their keffiyehs off and kind of circling him, etc., and pushing him around. Okay, there's nothing illegal about that necessarily. But if people say, I don't want you in my company because of that, well, so be it. And if I don't want you in my restaurant because you do things like that, so be it. And that makes people, look, we're not in the business of ending anti-Semitism. It's been around for a couple of millennium, at least. It's going to be around for hundreds and hundreds of years, long after all of us are gone and dead, and our great-great-great-grandchildren are gone and dead. It will be here. But we do have the ability to shut it down, to turn the faucet down. So the faucet doesn't flow freely; it just drips. That we have the ability, and one of the tools is social ostracism. So there's a fine line sometimes. But if you're going to say some things in public, I think you have to be willing to take criticism and maybe some consequences that are not government consequences and are not in any way threatening your physical, your freedom, etc. And you have the freedom of speech. You are allowed to say this stuff. Understand there's consequences for whatever you and I say as well. We say something that people find very offensive, we're going to hear from them. And I think that's appropriate.
The places that sometimes make me a little uncomfortable, I'm not sure how I feel about it, is when it's undergrads, because you sort of think a little bit, that's the time when you have your worst ideas in a way, and now
some of your best ideas.
Yeah, and some of your best ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
But now it'll follow.
You're becoming an adult, and I think that's a good point, and I think it's something we should think about a little bit. Having said that, I talked about the Barnard statement.
Yeah.
I think people have to be told what you've done is blood libel. Do you know what blood libel is? Here's what blood libel is. You said millions of people have been killed. I had a student at GW say to me one point, I was on a panel on anti-Semitism. This kid was from Students for Justice for Palestine, nice young man, and said to me, well, what do you say about the fact that Israel has sterilized 200,000 Ethiopian Jews? And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that. He said, then I said to the young man, I said, how many Ethiopian Jews are in Israel? He said, well, I don't know. I said, well, it's my understanding it's a little over 100,000. So what you're saying is Israel has sterilized every Ethiopian Jew, and most of them twice, men, women, and children. He said, well, maybe it's tens of thousands. I said, can you tell me if there's some information you have to say that? I'll be happy to look into it. He said, well, even if it's one, isn't that bad enough? I said, well, one is bad, yes, but what you just said is horrible. You have a responsibility not to say things that are horrible that you don't have any evidence for. And undergraduates at Barnard, they may be 18 years old, they may be 22 years old, but they are smart. They should know. It'd be a great life lesson. You don't say things that are really, really dangerous and really, really horrible when you have no evidence for it. So yes, maybe we should be particularly concerned. We also should not make it clear there are consequences. You just can't do this as an adult and think that, oh, I can walk away, say any, and we certainly see a lot of that on the right. We see it from an ex-president. You don't get to do this without consequences. And if you do, here's the other thing that we need to worry about. We don't control everything. We don't control what happens in the Middle East. We don't control what's happening with our democracy. If we lose our democracy, every Jew in this country ought to be concerned, because Jews don't do well, by and large, in non-democratic countries. The counterpoint might have been until recently, Putin in Russia. Putin, protected Jews. It's the best, for some years, it was the best place. Parts of Russian history were Putin, and he was certainly an increasingly autocratic leader. Well, we know now that was a pretty flimsy hope, because without any institutions that protect you, if the strong man changes his or her mind, if there's a new strong man, who's going to protect you? We lose democracy here. That's big stuff, and it's going to hurt lots of people, but it certainly can't be good for the Jews. And these are larger issues that there are many things we can and should do to combat anti-Semitism, starting with security for our institutions, but going on to many other things we could talk about. But there are things beyond this, bigger issues that we don't control.
So I think we have time for one more question. And a lot of people are asking about college campuses in a lot of different ways. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what should college campuses be doing to combat anti-Semitism? Maybe talking more from the administration perspective.
Yeah, I teach in a college,
Right.
So supposedly I know something about this, and I'm not sure I do. Been reading Gil Troy a lot. He's got some very strong opinions on this. Well, first, I think it's not just college administrators. I think all of us, when we're confronted with tough issues, and from, say, another community, you were talking about, supporting people in other communities, we often expect 100% support. There are things when people have made accusations of racism, et cetera, or demands that I think, is this reasonable or not? And one of the things I found very helpful for me is to say, okay, if someone says, okay, I want to take down statues of, and this is a more obvious one, but statues of racism that imply racism, like the Lee statue, et cetera. Ask yourself, what would you feel about statues to Nazi leaders in your country? And put yourself in the other person's place. And so I would ask college administrators to think, okay, so if something like this happened to Hispanic students, what would be my reaction? We're a place that, let's be honest, almost all these, most college campuses are places which are dominated by progressives and liberals, my allies, my people I work with all the time. Ask yourself what a liberal institution would do with another minority. And then ask yourself, what would you do with Jews? And I would hope you wouldn't have the mindset that Jews are automatically white settler colonialists and people wear black hats and they have lots of money. Because we all know, like, half of Israel is from the Middle East. We can, if you don't have any context, et cetera, on this, then you start believing this Manchian worldview. Manchian worldview does not stand up if you know any historical context, if you know a lot of facts. It's not a simple black and white world. So why should the Jews be treated in a double standard, whether it's Israel or Jews? And I think this is where you start. And so I don't think colleges should be a place where administrations easily just use words that are not immediately violence to say, okay, you're no longer part of an institution under any circumstances, especially with students, unless you have certain rules that follow, you have that everybody in the institution follows. And that you're saying if we're treating African Americans or we're treating conservatives, etc., one way, we should be treating Jews the same. And I don't think that's happening in many college campuses. I know my alumni association is Stanford and Harvard, and they did not handle things well right away. I think that some of the secondary reaction has been better, but I think again, Jews are things that other people could not get would be very strongly criticized, are not being criticized. And speech, defending free speech does not mean you can't criticize something. You can say, you have the right to say this. I happen to find this odious, and it's against the principles of the school and what we stand for. Like October 7th. It shouldn't be too hard to say, whatever your views are, this is odious stuff. Now you can say it, but we're going to tell you we think that your views are really warped. It's okay. And Jews, like everybody else, should not have to worry about their physical safety on any campus. And that doesn't mean that Jews can't, like everybody else, can't be challenged and can't sometimes be uncomfortable, but their physical safety, their ability to get an education, that should be, just like every other student, that should be taken very seriously. I do think what's going on with the Education Department in Title VI in the Biden administration is going to give a lot of these people pause that they have to do it, whether they want to or not. And again, not to say everything the Biden administration does is well. I'm a big supporter, but I think they've handled much of this very well. And even some things that, Israel may not, the current Israeli government may not like pauses in if not a ceasefire, pauses in the conflict to let hostages out or let refugees to go. Maybe that's the way to go. I don't know.
Well, thank you very much. I know we're over, but this has been really, educational for me, and I'm sure for everyone who is listening.
Thank you, Ira and Sarah, for taking the time to join our Moment audience. As a reminder, you can find information about upcoming conversations and new articles on our website at momentmag.com. Again, thank you to everyone for joining us.